I'm going to be boring about the second alias de Coakley again. As I said in a video last night, I hadn't realised. I had noted that he died in Hemel Hempstead Hospital while living in London Colney, which isn't far away, of course. What I hadn't noted was that McAlpine's building firm has its headquarters in Hemel Hempstead, where the second alias de Coakley died. And I did say last night the second alias de Coakley was road reconstruction. He constructed roads or reconstructed roads. Operative, something like that. Anyway, to do that, I would imagine he'd have to work for a building firm. And clearly the nearest building firm to him is McAlpine's, or was McAlpine's. Okay, I've kind of established that bit, I think, that if I were doing that kind of work personally, and lived in London Colney, not that I would know that I was going to die in Hemel Hempstead, I would choose the building firm to work for that was in Hemel Hempstead, and that was McAlpine's. Right, my father, the other alias de Coakley, as I've said tediously now, also worked for McAlpine's. So what we're talking about here, by the way, is Lord McAlpine, the man who stands accused of paedophilia, and I would never, as I said already, argue with that. So far, so good. Except that, as I may have said, I now have almost too many similarities for my liking between the two alias de Coakleys. So many that I have to wonder all over again if actually there were one alias de Coakley, but that would mean a conjuring trick when the first died in 1994, since the second died in 2000. That would mean a few crooked people. That would mean a fake death, which my brother and I were taken in by the way. It would mean that we'd buried someone who wasn't in fact dead, which is not to say there was a corpse in the coffin. I assume that if you're going to play this kind of conjuring trick, well, you either swap corpses so that there is a corpse in the coffin but not the right one, or you bury an empty coffin. I do feel I'm getting, said before, I feel like I'm getting in a James Bond territory, but there aren't too many other options open to me as to this second alias de Coakley, actually. I've been working on this for 5 years, and it's gone round, as anyone can tell, in my head for 5 years, and I still don't have the answer. Still, let me stick with the second alias de Coakley for a moment. I've said this before as well. Although he was 81 years old and had COPD and died in hospital, he had a post-mortem. My mother, who died at home in her armchair with only one person present who was not medically qualified, did not have a post-mortem at any point in time. They're not that routine. You know, if you're expecting somebody to die and they're old and they have a terminal disease and they're in hospital, you wouldn't think, I wouldn't think, as a lay person, that a post-mortem would be necessary. And given that he had died tediously again on the 6th anniversary of Fionn Green's death, at which my alias de Coakley was present, I don't think his death was natural. I think somebody decided to finish him off on that date. Now, I have someone who lived close by and had the means, etc., etc. And guess what? His name was Robin Stoddart. the same name as the man who was at Fiona Green's death. Granted, it was a different Robin Stoddart, because the one who was present at Fiona Green's death was murdered by a UDA hitman in 1996, and Dick Oakley died in 2000. So we are looking at a different Robin Stoddart, whom I originally found just by Googling the name. And he, as I have also tediously said, also turned up at a murder. He worked for The Guardian, and he was the downstairs neighbour of Martin Brooke Warwick, who was stabbed to death. So this Robin Stoddart, although he was a reporter of The Guardian, was interviewed in connection to the murder. I guess they didn't pin it on him, although I'm pinning it on him. Post-mortem, the man is now dead. He died in 2012, and his obituary said that he was born in Teesside. He was not born anywhere in the UK, in point of fact. He does fit with an immigrant, Robin Stoddart, who came in as a child. And now I'm in danger of getting too mixed up here. But one came in 1948, aged 3. I think this is the correct one. Doesn't really matter, in some ways, where he came from. What matters is what he had the opportunity to do. And okay, I'm going to say this. MI6 was mentioned at the death of Martin Brooke Warwick. Apparently journalists quite often work for MI6, and although they vehemently denied it had anything to do with them, I don't believe it. I'm saying this Robin Stoddart was a hitman. That's what I am saying. He lived in Welwyn Garden City, and I've been drawing a few maps today. Having immediately, of course, forgotten the distance from Welwyn Garden City to Hemel Hempstead. I think it's about 16 miles, something like that. In other words, not far. Might be slightly further. However, en route from Welwyn Garden City to Hemel Hempstead, you pass straight through London Colney, where alias Dick Oakley Mark II lived. So I could work out a little sequence of events here, really. It wouldn't be difficult at all. And, when I think about it, I've had a similar experience. And I did think about it when I was out today with my dog. Let's suppose, just for a minute, I'm supposing just for a minute, Robin Stoddart set out from Welwyn Garden City where he lived. I have to further suppose that he knew this second alias Dick Oakley, and that he was admitted to his house, or home, in the same way that, in my belief, he was admitted to Martin Brooke Warwick's home. Well, the man had COPD. I suppose there's a number of things you could do to instantly put him in hospital. I know there are a number of things you could do to instantly put him in hospital, since I now have COPD. But you wouldn't want to be the one to call the ambulance. You'd want to do whatever you did to exacerbate his breathing problems, and you'd want to get someone else to call the ambulance. Well, I know there are ways that can be done. I'll come to my experience in a minute. So he does his thing, somebody else calls an ambulance, and alias Dick Oakley Mark II winds up in Hemel Hempstead Hospital. Now at this point, if you want him to die on the 16th of February, which in my belief someone did, you've got to finish him off. So the good friend goes to the hospital. Of course, you might think the alias Dick Oakley might not want him there by this time, but then again, perhaps he was in no position to protest. Once you're in the hospital, No particular strength required. You only have to be, in with the patient on your own for 30 seconds. Take away the oxygen, disconnect the oxygen. How easy is that? Very. I am theorizing, in other words, A, that Robin Stoddart was a hitman, and that he was responsible for the death of Martin Brooke Warwick, and B, that he was also responsible for the death of the second alias Dick Oakley, timing it for the 16th of February. Still not knowing, by the way, if the second alias Dick Oakley was the same as the first, but leaving that aside for the moment. Now to come to my experiences, which makes me think this is entirely possible. I have talked about Ken Browning, who had a heart attack at my home, and yet his death certificate says he died in the General Hospital. I was convinced he was dead when he fell. Partly because when the ambulance came, it didn't put on its sirens or its lights, its flashing lights, and I seem to recall the ambulance men just shaking their head and loading him in. There you have, by the way. I am also assuming that he was murdered, for a lot of reasons. He'd made an enemy of the man called Greg Byworth, and it was not required that he should testify at the trial of various members of a porn/paedophile ring. I am assuming that if he was on my side of town, his side of town was much closer to the General Hospital, if he'd thought he was having a heart attack. Much simpler to go from Lord's Hill, if you look on a map, to the General Hospital, than to go from Lord's Hill to Harefield, where I lived. En route was my parents' house, and my parents, I happen to know, had a box that Ken Browning wanted, and they wouldn't give it to him. I know this because he caused a dreadful fuss one night and upset my daughter, who was staying with him at the time. I think he went to my parents' house en route to mine. There are various substances that can bring on a heart attack. I don't know quite how you would administer one without the victim being aware of it, but I'm sure there are ways. Does sound like James Bond, doesn't it? Ken Browning arrives at my place, has symptoms of a heart attack, as far as I, as a layperson, know, but paces my sitting room for 2 hours. Did not want a doctor, did not want an ambulance. If it were now, I'd call one anyway. I didn't then. I also didn't think that a man who was having a heart attack would be in a position to pace up and down, and having spoken recently to someone who's had a heart attack, it seems unlikely, because it seems to lay you out flat, in tremendous pain. So I'm assuming that he'd been given something that would give him a heart attack delayed by an hour or two. There are substances. Right. Who in the end is the person who calls the ambulance? Me. Because Ken Browning collapsed in the car park on the way to the car which was going to be driven by my ex-husband to take him to the hospital. My ex-husband having returned from apparently driving my mother home from a glass engraving class, which is a little bit odd because I have a card to say that very morning, the 22nd of February 1989, my mother had been in accident and emergency at the General Hospital. So whatever the problem had been, I'm a little surprised that she went to the glass engraving class. Anyway, my husband had also been to my parents' house that night, and then he returned to mine, just in time for me to say, "Can we please drive Ken to the hospital?" I think that would be quicker than calling an ambulance. So Ken then collapsed in the car park, just before we could get to the car. I ran upstairs to call an ambulance, leaving my ex-husband with Ken, which I had a few qualms about because, as I have said in some long ago video, they'd spent quite a lot of time threatening to kill each other, even though they were working for the same pawn ring. Ken, my husband, ex, and Greg Byworth. On the little magazine, the Love Hearts, the Lonely Hearts magazine, that was the cover for the ring. Still, they had threatened to kill each other on not a few occasions, and I thought my husband was quite capable of it, so I didn't really want to leave him with Ken, but I didn't have a choice because there weren't any mobiles that I know of in 1989, or I certainly didn't have one. I had to go upstairs to my flat and use the landline. Then I had to stay in the flat because at least one of my daughters was there that night. It's awful that I can't remember whether they both were, but at least one was. And I couldn't leave her. It must have been my youngest. I might well have left the oldest because she would have been a teenager by then. I'd have left her for an hour or two, perhaps. So what happened then? My ex-husband went in the ambulance with Ken Browning. Now, but hang on. If he was already dead, why would anyone need to go in the damned ambulance with him? Anyway, my ex-husband did. I don't know what happened after that because I wasn't there. I only ever had my ex-husband's word for it. And he told me that the ambulance men had told him that Ken was dead as he fell. Yet Ken's death certificate says he died in the hospital, not at 34 Willow Close in Southampton, where I lived. So I've got that whole sequence there, actually. The necessary done probably at my parents' house. The person to call the ambulance, me, and the person to finish the job, my ex-husband. The same sequence I believe I'm looking at with Robin Stoddart and Alias de Coakley II, starting out in Welwyn Garden City, second stop London Colney, where Alias de Coakley lived, third stop Hemel Hempstead Hospital to finish the job. And that is my theory, and I believe it.